Welcome to Fuse, the global podcast for the PRCA, where we explore the evolving landscape of global communications. We bring together leaders from public relations, politics, business, academia, and the media to spark new ideas and ignite innovation. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Now, I'm going to start off just by explaining to the audience a little bit about your background, your bio, before we go into our conversation. So, John has been a trade journalist for 20 years. He started out writing about the pubs and drinks industry at the Morning Advertiser, rising through the ranks to become news editor before moving to M&C Report, the title for the wider hospitality and leisure sectors. He left M&C Report in 2014 to join PRWeek as deputy editor. This year marks a decade for John at PRWeek, where he has been UK editor since 2019. John is heavily involved in PRWeek UK's output, including major projects such as the UK Top 150, the Powerbook, and the Pay Gap project with people like us. He is the holder of a postgraduate diploma in journalism from City University and a first-class degree in politics and history, named the best digital journalist blogger at the 2019 PRCA Digital Awards. So welcome. Now, John, one of the questions what I want to ask is, you were obviously enjoying yourself in food and drink, lots of, I'm sure, wonderful experiences, testing everything out before you write. Why did you move from food and drink media to PRWeek? Because that's quite a segue.
Well, it is. I mean, on the surface, it is. And I did enjoy food and drink. And it was, when I started, I was writing a lot about the pub industry. And actually, there was a lot of politics and hard news involved, because when I was there, it was during a lot of regulation and change in that sector. So everything from smoking ban, licensing law change, the so-called 24-hour drinking, tax and regulation going up, cheap supermarket alcohol, fake IDs, you name it. It was actually very, very political. I spent a lot of time in Parliament, actually, and sort of talking to lobbyists and comms people, actually, in that sector. And then I moved over after about 7 years from Morning Advertiser, and then going to M&C Report, it was a bit more kind of standard business journalism, if you like. It was mergers, acquisitions, investments, company results, and that sort of thing, although still with a bit of politics there. So I kind of felt that, in a way, I'd sort of ticked both those boxes of the sort of political hard news stuff and the sort of more businessy stuff. So I was kind of looking for another challenge. But yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting sector, and looking at the way sort of pubs and bars and restaurants were kind of evolving and changing. And I always thought it was a sector where everyone had an opinion, that you could talk to anyone about pubs, about restaurants, about things they like and don't like. Whereas I think if you're writing about other sectors, it might seem a little bit niche. And it was nice to sort of be able to go and see these things. I think, there was quite a perception that, we're spending our whole time just sort of drinking and rating beers and, bars and that sort of stuff. And I mean, part of the problem was, I actually do a lot more of that now that I'm at PRWeek, partly because my old office was in Crawley. We're basically halfway between London and Brighton in a business park. And that was when we were in the office, usually 5 days a week. And I was living in Brighton. So on a practical basis, it was a bit tricky to do that too often. And at M&C Report, I used to get into the office at 6:30 in the morning. So the idea of having a kind of heavy night with drinks the night before was kind of not much of a prospect, really. So in terms of moving on to Haymarket into PRWeek, it was partly I was just looking for an industry that just looked interesting, that looked like there was a lot going on, and also didn't feel limited in a sense. I mean, one of the things about this industry is it touches everything. PR and comms is part of every single sector that you could imagine. So I loved the variety. And I wanted to move to London on a personal basis, because I was living in Brighton and in and around Brighton for many years. So I got to do that. And also a bigger company. Haymarket is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, sort of independent publishers out there. And my last one was more of a kind of, was mid-size. It was, a decent company too. Interestingly, both kind of family businesses in a sense, but something that not a lot of people think about really when they think of publishers like Haymarket and William Reed.
I realised it was a family business. Did you have any perceptions of the PR industry before you moved in? So obviously now you've spent a decade in the industry, but when you were sort of leaving food and drink media, was your sort of perception very different to the reality that you've experienced?
Yeah, it absolutely was. I think for a lot of journalists, PR is synonymous with media relations because that's the only bit you see. And I think that's understandable. But I really think once you get into the industry, you see all of the ins and outs of the other elements, whether that's content production or, lobbying or just sort of counsel or whatever it might be. It's really goes way, way beyond what I sort of associated with it. I mean, unfortunately, quite a lot of the stereotypes about the industry were a bit negative. There's the cliches about being sort of hounded with press releases and calls and sort of, badly targeted press releases and all that sort of stuff. And that does exist. I've got a theory that in every industry, like a third of it is not up to scratch. A third of it is probably really good. And the other third is somewhere in between. And I think if you think about the pub industry, probably a third of pubs you'd never, ever want to step foot in, but you just don't. And then a third of pubs or bars, you might think, oh, that's quite nice. And then the rest are probably somewhere in between. So I don't know, maybe this is a bit of a silly theory, but that's the way I think about these things. And I think it's probably the same with people who work in comms. There's a section of the industry that probably needs to sort of, could do better, if you like. But then there are a lot of people who are really, really good. And then others sort of muddling on in between, I suppose. And part of what we do is to sort of help more people kind of get better at what they're doing in any ways we can and keep them informed. But, no industry is perfect. And there were those stereotypes, as I say. And I sort of felt there were some big companies in that industry where they seemed to change their agencies a lot. And I remember finding that a bit frustrating and not quite understanding, because we were only told about PR agencies in our journalism training course. So I found it a bit confusing. I mean, I know a lot more about it now, but, and I'd generally prefer to go to the sort of in-house people because I felt they sort of knew the business, and I would sort of maybe unfairly assume that the agency folk are less likely to know what they're talking about, frankly, which is probably a bit harsh. But there was quite a lot of truth in that back in the day, unfortunately.
Yeah, but also if the PR agency is being changed every, sort of 6 months or a year, then it doesn't actually allow itself, for the agency people to get to know the business as much as in-house, because the in-house tenure tends to sort of be longer than the agency sort of being retained. Now, I mean, I've been in the PR industry for about 14 years, and I've noticed a huge exodus of sort of people from journalism into PR. And obviously that's, underlying it as many drivers, including the decline of journalism and the rise of social media advertising and so forth. But here you are, a journalist that has still remained being a journalist, and you're in the PR industry. Have you ever thought, should I remain in journalism or should I actually cross over and work in PR like so many journalists have?
Yeah, I mean, I think it crosses your mind inevitably, really, if you work in this industry, and particularly if you're in the kind of strange position I'm in, where I write about people in that industry as a journalist. And incidentally, quite a lot of people think I am a PR person, or I have a PR background, and I don't at all. Yeah, I mean, I think it does. I also think there's something about being a trade journalist that you see the difficulties of people in the industry, and that can sometimes put you off. Whereas I think if people don't really know, if you go into an industry not necessarily knowing a huge amount about it, and you start at the bottom and then you learn it as you go along, you kind of come in with a different perspective. I'll go back to the sort of pub sort of comparison. I'd never ever want to run a pub, having written about them for years, because it just looked so difficult, like the amount of stuff you have to put up with. And I don't feel the same about PR, but I do think that there's an element of, I've got so much respect for people in the industry who can kind of deal with all of these multiple things that they have to deal with. And there's an element of finding that a bit daunting. So that's something that I consider. And, would I be able to do it as well? I mean, who knows? I feel a bit unfair sometimes that part of my job is to sort of critique what happens in the industry. And, someone could rightly say, well, you've not actually done it yourself, John.
Yeah.
which is fair enough. But that's my job, I guess. But I mean, interested, but
interested, but you're a bit apprehensive, maybe because you've sort of been sitting too close to the ballet stage, and when you're too close, you sort of see everything, that's could be quite problematic. And also, I guess, being a journalist, you're sort of reporting not always necessarily on the good news side of the industry. So you often see the sort of the problems of the industry, and I guess also journalists. Some I've seen have made incredible careers, and others have actually really struggled. So it's not always necessarily a well-trodden path. So having been in the industry for a decade, and you've seen everything. I mean, you've obviously gone through the COVID the COVID era. I'll do that again. Sorry. So, John, you've been in the industry for 10 years. Talk me through what are the big sort of stories and the sort of the big trends that you've seen over the last 10 years. And obviously you've reported through the COVID era, perma crisis, the multipolar world, the expansion of in-house teams, advertising sort of, struggling, and PR jumping in and filling the void. And also PR's trying to sort of find their way in this new world, because when I started out 14 years ago, we were very just media relations and and events, and now media relations is a tiny fraction of what we do. And so you must, from your vantage point, you must have seen an awful lot in the last 10 years. I'd love to sort of just hear your thoughts in terms of what's really struck you.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I've got a theory that I think that the sort of the perma-crisis era has really transformed the industry largely in a good way. I mean, obviously there's caveats that there's a lot of very bad things happening, and there's been business failures, and there's been a hell of a lot of challenges and difficulties. But in terms of the overall value of the industry that people with power perceive it, I think there's been a lot of good. I mean, really, I think since 2016 EU referendum, Trump, and really the sort of ratcheting up of the sort of climate crisis talk, and also we have things like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, moving into, as you say, COVID. Obviously, there's a real sense that organisations, particularly businesses, just need really good advice, and they need to sort of cover it in multiple ways. So they need good communications, media relations, all that sort of stuff, but also combining that with public affairs, lobbying, and in many senses consume as well, but also kind of being experts at doing this in multiple channels, not least social media. And I think that has meant that, and we really saw in the sort of years from 2016 onwards, the sort of growth of those agencies that had corporate and public affairs capabilities. They were really in the sort of sweet spot then, because nobody knew what was happening, particularly, as I say, post EU referendum in the UK, and the rise of the sort of populism, this general sense of, well, permacrisis is the word that we can use time and again, but it seems like the best one. So there's really been that factor that's kind of transformed things. But at the same time, if you look at things like consumer PR, I remember when I first started, there were quite a few consumer PR agencies that didn't have creative directors, and that would seem very strange now. Even a small consumer PR agency would have a creative director, if not a few people with similar creative type roles. And obviously, the bigger agencies now have full creative teams. So really, you've seen an absolute ratcheting up of the industry's sort of creative firepower. And that's helped by acquisitions. And we've seen quite a lot of those recently as well, to really sort of become a bit of become a creative force and compete in many ways with advertising. It's not without its challenges, but there's so I guess on the one hand you've sort of got that, and at the same time advertising itself has had trauma, ad blockers, this sense of cynicism about ads, and the sort of decline of traditional news viewings and the sort of traditional places where people would view ads, I guess, has kind of meant that earned media has been able to, in many cases, sort of step into the breach. But that's my sort of overview, really, I guess, of
it's been an incredible 10 years. But also what I wanted to ask you is, people often ask me sort of what is public relations, and often it still is synonymous with media relations. And one of the areas, or one of the challenges of the industry, is actually how to define its parameters. And so you mentioned obviously sort of public affairs and lobbying and communications, which is wider than just focusing on one channel of media relations. But you often have other industries that everyone's swimming in each other's lanes. So people sort of not really know the difference between marketing and sort of public relations, not knowing. And then you've got sort of law firms coming in and sort of launching sort of reputation management services. In the US, for instance, you've got a lot of law firms that actually have been doing public affairs for quite a while, and that's quite normal for them. In the UK, less so. You've then got management consulting firms that are now sort of bringing in sort of reputation and communication as part of their sort of remit. So how would you define the parameters of public relations, and have you seen these parameters shift over the 10 years that you've been watching our industry?
Yeah, I mean, they've definitely shifted. I mean, I think there's an advantages and disadvantages to the term public relations. I think the advantage is it can sort of mean many different things. So whereas I think, as we both said, it was largely synonymous with media relations not that long ago. And then there was the discussion about the land grab with influencer marketing. Should that fit with PR? Should that fit with advertising or marketing? And I think there's probably still a bit of debate there, although I don't, there's going to be a paid element to that. I mean, you've also seen the kind of rise of the sort of channel agnostic agencies that I think are really kind of not overthinking it in a way. They might call themselves PR agencies. And I was talking to an agency boss yesterday who was making that point that, we'd see them as a PR agency, but actually they produce adverts now. They do a lot of stuff that's above the line. And it's just really shifting. But I think it kind of works as long as they've got that sense of knowing what influences people, what people will want to read about and what interests them. And it's not just pure creativity. I think that feels like the sort of bottom line to me. But then, I mean, you could be purist about it and say earned media itself, once you start to have any kind of paid, whether that's, with influencers as part of a sort of an influence campaign, then that goes out of the realms of PR. And maybe it does on one level, but I kind of think most people who succeed in this industry are just a bit pragmatic about it. And they realize that you've got to sort of shift and do what works rather than be overly concerned about about definitions. But I'm not sure I answered your question there, or just went around the houses a bit.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think we are quite a pragmatic profession, and it's almost like the PR industry sort of operates with these sort of underlying tectonic plates that are constantly moving, and we're constantly trying to find our feet. And when you look back, social media is quite relatively recent, and it's completely transformed the communication landscape. And ultimately, it depends upon what your definition of public relations is. I also noticed quite a lot of PR firms sort of start feeling that they should drop the word PR from their name, and they sort of go into, whatever their name is, strategic communications or even consulting. And it sort of makes me think, do they feel that the word PR actually has a PR problem itself? And therefore, is it because it's part synonymous with media relations and it doesn't explain the full gamut of their services? Or is it because actually, some people do consider PR as quite a dark industry of manipulation and its roots? So do you think the PR industry has a PR problem?
To some extent, yes. I think part of the problem is there was I always think there are kind of two extremes of sort of pejorative stereotypes about PR. One of them is the kind of absolutely fabulous, sort of fluffy, vacuous type, and the other is the kind of Malcolm Tucker, aggressive, spinning, lying, unpleasant type. And there is probably an element of both of them in the industry still, but it's obviously so much more than that and very different to that. But yeah, it does. I mean, part of the problem is people can't see it. People don't know what it does. If you said you work in adverts, people know what an advert is. People don't know what PR is. But it's, in a way, it's its advantage that it's about influencing what people write and what people don't write, and what influencers post and don't post, and the sort of subtleties and nuances involved. So I think it is a problem, and I think it's particularly a problem because it can feel like a bit of a closed shop. I just think the sort of lack of recognition means that sometimes people going into the industry, and I've heard this said before, most people in the industry will know somebody else in the industry, whether that's a family member or like a family friend or something like that. Most people don't come from nothing to work in PR. Whereas I don't know if you could say the same about advertising, because people from lots of backgrounds will know what advertising is, right? And lots of other industries, you can look at financial services or pick any other industry. So I think PR is unusual in that sense. So yeah, I think that's its biggest problem. I mean, the kind of wider debates around, the definition of PR and do we have a sort of inferiority complex is one thing, but I think the sort of practical problem links to lack of diversity, because it simply just doesn't resonate with a lot of people who aren't from backgrounds with people in PR, frankly. So I think that's a wider problem that the industry needs to deal with. And I do think that comes down to the sort of fact that people don't really know what it is. But again, I don't really know what to do. I wouldn't really know what to do about it.
Yeah, it's such an interesting point, because actually, people going into finance, they've got touch points like banks, people going into advertising, sort of touch points in terms of seeing, billboards or adverts. But PR is so difficult to actually, if you don't have a family member or somebody in your community from the PR industry, it's really difficult to sort of, get this sort of touch points. And you also have a lot of public relations degree courses are sort of reduced in numbers in terms of undergrad. They're still there in terms of postgrad. And so what you often find is actually a lot of people falling into PR, not actually, sort of thinking, as a child, I want to grow up and work in the PR industry. They discover it sometimes, just, a bit of serendipity falling in. So I think, that industry, I think that aspect makes it quite interesting. And then you also have a lot of churn. So people sort of come in, a huge, sort of influx at sort of account executive level. And then you have a lot of sort of churn at the account manager level. Do you think that the PR industry is in a better position today than it was 10 years ago? Is it better suited to the needs of clients and, and C-suite today than it was before? There's a lot of, PRs used to always argue that they were like the poor cousins of marketing. That you'd have a CMO on the board. You wouldn't really have a, chief communications officer on the board, or sort of, corporate affairs. And they were never invited to the table in terms of strategic thinking. It was always sort of, it was very marketing led. It was before sort of stakeholder capitalism really sort of, had a strong foothold, where it was very much sort of the customer as a stakeholder. And that's where the sort of the marketing people had the ear of the CEO. So do you think actually in the last 10 years, it's worked in our favor or not?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, we kind of alluded to it earlier on that the sort of beefed up corporate affairs role has been a huge theme since I've been at PRWeek. And again, it's something that has kind of accelerated during the time of permacrisis. You get corporate affairs directors now that previously maybe they'd have dealt with external and internal comms, maybe public affairs. And now, there can be branding, sustainability, social strategy, and several other things as well. So that's definitely been a factor. And I do think, you are seeing more of them on the C-suite. And interestingly, another trend I heard of recently is boards of other companies, not PR firms, looking to bring comms corporate affairs directors on as non-exec type roles, just because that role is well respected. So from that point of view, I feel that the industry has kind of become more prominent. And I think the big caveat though with that is, and we're probably half an hour into this conversation, I'm going to be the first time I'm going to mention AI, but I do think that's the big challenge at the moment, right? It's kind of, I think if this was a year ago or a year and a half ago, I think it would all look, very rosy in that sense. But this is the big question mark. I think the industry's got to get to grips with AI to really show that it's going to be a useful, a vital discipline to counter things like misinformation and disinformation, and also proactively for things like, campaigning work and, and being more efficient. So I feel that's the big question mark. But AI aside, I think the industry has definitely been proving its worth as an extremely useful force.
I think also with AI, it depends upon your approach. I was with some PRs last night, and one said that there was a note that went around, and it said any person in the agency that is using AI will be immediate dismissal. And you have other agencies that are very much, creating an AI policy, integrating it into their sort of work, and the same with in-house as well. So I think it's really interesting people having either a fear response or, oh, this could be an opportunity for us. And I think that's going to be, sort of filter out those who gain and lose from AI.
There's a really interesting parallel. I remember when social media started becoming popular. I remember my company banned the journalists or anyone in the company from accessing Facebook, which seems ridiculous now. Imagine banning journalists from being able to access social media. It'd be like, what the hell are you doing? But that was the policy, and we didn't really think much of it because social media was seen as chatting to your mates and poking each other or inviting someone to something to do with zombies or whatever. What days they were. And I think there's a real parallel there that, I think people might look back to those times when, staff were banned from using AI and think similarly, what were you doing? You've got to get on top of this, understand it, don't shy away from it or try to ban it.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I remember those days. And also I remember sort of, people thinking, well, let's just give it to the intern. And and it was and they just and it was very much a fair response and also a sense of not wanting to sort of not yield to change and also a sense of this is a blip, it's going to go away if you just have the ostrich strategy and it's it's incredible how we use social media today. Now obviously with what I alluded to earlier in terms of, a lot of journalists moving into the PR industry, a lot of sort of, decline in revenues going into journalism, consequently sort of much smaller teams. Back in the day when we were pitching to journalists, it was very much journalists were the gatekeeper and the PRs would sort of fling information, at the journalists, and the journalists would be the gatekeeper in terms of verifying facts, choosing which one sort of should get into the, into sort of the public realm, through their, be it broadcast or print. But now things are really different. So PR people actually, only a fraction of the work that they create goes via the gatekeeper, the journalist. The majority now goes straight, be it through podcasts or socials or blogs or white papers or whatever. So do you think now PRs have more responsibility, especially in an age of disinformation and misinformation, and the PR industry should be looking at some form of regulation or qualification, because of course information can harm if it's misinformation and disinformation. And now anybody, in the PR industry with a smartphone, when you set up a PR firm, you don't have to register. A lot of people aren't sort of subscribed to the industry bodies. So a lot of people can just set up without any training around ethics, etc. So how do you think that has an impact on the PR industry now that we can communicate directly and that responsibility that used to be in the hands of the journalists is now sort of handed over to a lot of people working in our industry?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting that, isn't it? I mean, you've definitely seen the kind of the owned channels, the rise of the owned channels, and the fact that, a lot of people are cutting out the journalists who they might see as the middlemen. I think I can understand why they'd want to do it. I think there are a lot of downsides, and trust often comes into this, doesn't it? People talk about the Edelman Trust Barometer and what that shows. And a lot of the time, there was a time when trust in the media was declining, but at the same time, people have their trusted media that they do look to and they do expect to be valid and to be correct. And I think there's a real danger that if with a sort of proliferation of messaging coming out directly from brands and from, political parties or whoever it might be, that actually there's going to be so much that it will just be too much for people. They won't really believe any of it. But what they will believe is what they read in their trusted news source, whichever one that is. So although there's not going to be as many of them, and maybe their reach won't be as dramatic as it used to be, I do think that the comms industry needs to recognise the fact that if a trusted media source says something, it's worth a hell of a lot more than if it comes directly from that source. And the public aren't stupid, but what they will be is inundated with messaging. So in a way, we all just block it out, don't we? I mean, if you just scroll on X these days, there are so many messages, so many, talk about at the moment, there's all the kind of conspiracy theories about the royals following the photo. And it's a good example, really. I think that, you're probably going to want to go to your trusted media source to see what's actually happening with that, because we could all read a lot of scare stories, a lot of speculation, but it doesn't mean we believe it. We might enjoy it, doesn't mean we believe it. And I think that's an important point.
I mean, I've got a 15-year-old daughter, and I try to get her to read, the BBC and, sort of the traditional news, and she just gets her news from TikTok. And it does worry me, because I think that, people or children who haven't been brought up with traditional media and understanding all of the sort of the fact checking, the verification and so forth, and what they sort of go into instead is sort of sensational content that's been created by people with a commercial agenda or a political agenda, and not kind of understanding about sort of independent reporting. And so I do worry a little bit about sort of younger generations that because sort of my generation, we straddle both. So we understand that when something's going, some rumors on X, we would then look for a verified source. But those who haven't really been brought up with, with traditional media may not. And that's the sort of the question I had with, if a lot of comms people are producing content on behalf of their clients or their company, what guardrails do you think the industry should have, if any?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to sort of industry bodies, doesn't it? That, we've had situations with the PRCA sort of taking action against a small number of agencies. I mean, obviously, the most dramatic one was Bell Pottinger back in, 2017. And there's been one or two more. I do think that the industry needs to look carefully at this, because any kind of... I think the industry does have a reputation, but it goes back to the reputation problem in a sense as well, because I think journalists are very cynical. And I think if they see that a PR person or PR agency is kind of spinning them, is telling something that's not quite true, they're going to remember that. And they're not necessarily going to want to take what they say in the future firsthand. So, and this is important, because I think sometimes as an industry we can look at reach too much, but we're not looking at trust. And I think this goes back to that point about your trusted source. And, even though people might look at something that's, wild and out there, and they might enjoy it, it doesn't necessarily mean they believe it. And I think that the sort of the royal photos is a really good example. I mean, I think we've all on some level enjoyed the wild speculation, but I think that's, and probably clicked on a lot of it and taken a look at it, but it doesn't mean we trust it at all. There's no sort of gauge, I don't think, for, you can look at traffic and eyeballs on an article. You can't look at how much people think it's true. And I think if your ultimate aim is to sell things or to encourage people to vote for you, that's the sort of thing that is ultimately important.
Yeah, absolutely. Because actually, some metrics are vanity metrics, and if you're focused upon outcome, then actually, trust is a intangible area to measure, and Edelman does a great job. But you're right. I think that trumps sort of the number of views that's out there. Now, in terms of industry initiatives, you have the top 150. Could you explain to our audience what the top 150 is? When does it come out? What does it cover?
Sure. So top 150. So each year we send a survey to agencies. We've got about 500 agencies in our top 150 database, and we ask them for their revenue and headcounts and various other things for the previous calendar year. And then we put them all together, and then we publish a list of the 150 biggest. So these are ranked by UK revenue. And then we do a lot of analysis around it. And generally it's our biggest editorial project, or maybe joint biggest editorial projects of the year. And it spurs loads of things. I mean, obviously, it's very popular because people want to see where their agency is, where their rivals are, who's up, who's down, who's out, who's in, all that sort of stuff. But it's also a kind of a moment to sort of take stock at how the industry's doing. We look at a huge number of other areas with it. So everything from acquisition plans to diversity to priority investment areas. And then we also break it down by different sectors. So everything, the ones you'd expect really: consumer, corporate, financial, healthcare, tech, etc. So it's a really comprehensive look at the sort of state of the agency landscape, really. Usually ends up being about 35-40 articles published across May. So we're crunching the numbers at the moment, and you just imagine how much data is involved. I've been emailing agencies trying to encourage them to sort of get some of their figures in, and sort of questioning some of the data they've sent us and all that sort of stuff. So it's a really big team effort, but it has a huge amount of interest. I mean, the top 150 article, launch article, is almost always our biggest story of the year, and it keeps getting read throughout the year. So it's a sort of resource for agencies themselves, but also the clients, because the clients want to know which agencies are doing well, who's growing quickly, all the rest of it. But also employees and potential employees, because they might want to know, how their business that they might be joining is doing. So it's a really big project, and one that a lot of agencies find, really helpful, because it can mean that they sort of get their name out there, really. So it works on a number of ways, really. But yeah,
how many years have you been doing it for? How many years have you been running? How many years have you been running the top 150 for?
Oh, I don't know, actually. I mean, long before I joined.
Okay, so that's quite interesting, because in those 10 years that you've been running, what have you noticed? Because you've obviously been keeping an eye on those agencies that grow really quickly and come out of nowhere, and those agencies that suffer a huge fall in revenue and profitability. So could you talk me through some of the drivers that you've noticed, the sort of commonalities around agencies that are the fast growth agencies?
Yeah, well, it comes back in a way to the sort of perma-crisis era. And one thing we noticed was the sort of growth of aggregate growth of the top 150 overall really accelerated in 2016 and remained at a high level. I mean, it was kind of, I think, sort of late single figures, early low double figures, which, considering a lot of other industries, was really strong. And it was really, for a lot of that, it was those agencies that were combining public affairs and corporate and also crisis, and throw in other things like healthcare as well, and financial comms and various other things. It was those that were kind of doing that to some extent that were sort of growing quickest. So we definitely saw that, and it allows you to do things like look at the post-COVID bounce back. So in 2020, as you can imagine, was the only year where the aggregate revenue dropped by 3 or 4%. And then the previous year, it grew by about 20%. So, sorry, the following year, it grew by something like 20%. So that was 21. And then in 2022, it was also about 15%. Crunching the numbers on what it's going to be for 2023 now. But that really sort of shows you how the industry as a whole has kind of bounced back. And I appreciate it's partly a correction because of the losses suffered during COVID. But you get to see other things as well. You get to see, the fact that in many ways consumer has been a trickier place in recent years, and it's partly due to sort of margin and budgets being squeezed and so on. And also it's kind of declined relative to the sort of corporate and public affairs, just because there has been that real sense of crisis. And I think the sort of the kind of era of social media and internet outrage has really kind of benefited a lot of agencies that deal with crisis comms, frankly. And so many corporations are risk averse. And that's partly because I think of them getting sort of counsel from agencies that, and indeed in-house teams that are kind of pointing out the hurdles of getting involved in, controversial issues and, joining the culture war, I guess. You've definitely seen that, haven't you, in the last year or so? So many more firms are kind of less willing to stick their head above the parapet when it comes to kind of controversial issues. And I don't think that's a coincidence. But so we've seen a lot of things like that. And you'll also see things like, we're going to see the impact on tech agencies, I'm sure, of the kind of slowdown and the sort of redundancies and so on that affected big tech firms in the last sort of year and a half or so. So we'll get to see things like that. But at the same time, we had a big jump for those agencies, in the sort of more immediate COVID crisis era, because, everyone was working from home and needed more technology. So, yeah, there are a huge number of those kind of trends that we track. And it's really, maybe I'm biased, but I do think it's essential reading if you're involved in the agency world. And actually, the launch article with the top 150, it's still, like, even last week it was in our top 15 most read articles, and we launched that in May 2023. So it gives you an idea about how much people look at it.
Yeah, and then you also have a monthly tracker as well. So it's not just every year in May, here's a big industry snapshot, but you also have ongoing.
Yes, we do.
Just for specific subscribers.
Yeah, so that goes to the same email database. Effectively, it's a kind of an offshoot of the top 150. That is where we ask them. We don't ask for figures as such. We just ask for sort of sentiment, really. Was the previous month much better than expected, a bit better than expected, worse than expected, and so on? And then we might ask about specific issues like redundancies or pitching and things like that. It's all anonymized, so there are no tables there. But that's a kind of like temperature check, really, of how the industry's doing. And as you say, each month that comes out, and then we have an article where we outline the data. And then people also give a commentary. We say people can send in up to 200 words on what they thought of trading in that month, and then we just publish all of them. Basically, we just have an article with lots of agency bosses. We usually get about 40 odd, and it's just there because I think one thing, and I think it's a general point with trade media. Actually, I think that sometimes there's this perception that like we should write more positive news, and we should sort of emphasize the positive more. But I actually think a lot of people feel better if they get negative news. And I think that's because they feel they're not alone. People say that to me quite a lot. It's like if you've had a tough month and you're like, oh God, I really feel this. And I've got my boss on my back, or I've got, or am I going to be able to pay my staff and all this sort of stuff. And then you see some results, like the trading tracker saying, people have had a negative time overall, then it's like, well, it's not just me then, and people feel a lot better. So, that's something that I sort of keep in mind with these things, that it's up to us to be, to tell it as it is and not try to sort of pretend things are better than they are sometimes. But equally, if people are having a good time, it's nice to say that as well.
Yeah, that's a very positive slant on delivering negative news on the industry. But I agree with you, actually, because sometimes when business is quite slow, and you just actually hear like the whole industry actually suffered a reduction, then it makes you feel, okay, actually it's nothing specifically that you're doing wrong. It's actually, more of an issue of, the economy. Now, I wanted to also ask about international work. So a lot of, there's certain sort of centres of excellence for public relations, and the UK is one of them, where other countries and organisations, when they're looking for sort of like some global support, they often come to the UK. Would you say that, I wanted to know, Why do you think the UK is considered a centre of excellence for public relations? Why do so many people from other countries come to the UK when they're sort of shopping for PR firms? And it's not always necessarily just focusing on the UK market; it's more sort of global lens.
Yeah, I think there are a few things. Firstly, I think the sort of history of English language writing and journalism, and let's face it, probably something that was expanded during the time of empire and so on. And obviously, our friends in America across the pond and lots of other places. So I think the sort of the English language element is probably one area that's useful. I think the fact that we're a services economy now, that's such a huge part of what we do, and the fact that London, where let's face it, most big PR agencies are based, and that's no slight on agencies outside London, of which there are many fantastic ones. But the fact is it's all kind of concentrated there within zone 1, I guess, and maybe zone 2. I think sort of gives it that kind of focus that you don't necessarily have in other countries. And I think there's something about the way we sort of talk and interact. We're kind of a country where diplomacy has historically been quite a big thing of what we do, and I guess this comes back to, maybe you could look at sort of the history of the country, but, I feel that sort of talking a good talk is something that we've kind of learned to do probably over a long time, and we've had to sort of, influence other countries for good or ill, and had an influence on a lot of countries, obviously a lot of which was downright horrendous. But nevertheless, I feel that there is a sense of, kind of the importance of getting on with people and being kind of diplomatic and using the sort of soft language and the kind of soft power element. That's something that the country is kind of has developed. And I think particularly, kind of post-Second World War, where Britain has kind of the soft power side of things and the sort of cultural kind of influence has been more significant than the hard power, for obvious reasons, that we became a less sort of prosperous and powerful country. So I don't know if I'm reading a bit too much into that, but as you mentioned, I study history, so I feel that there probably is something in the psychology of this country that means it is kind of set up for PR.
Yeah, well, I think the UK does have a very outsized influence in comparison to its military capability and its economy, with these global media outlets that they've spawned, from The Economist to the FT and the Times and BBC, and actually they're trusted as well around the world. The Guardian, for instance. And so I do a lot of international work, and they often say that for them, the only journalism that they respect is actually the journalism still practiced in the UK. And so that's, and I think perhaps, us as PRs, we sort of piggyback on the excellence of the journalists and the media outlets that we're lucky to have as a country.
I think so. I think the BBC probably has had a big impact on that, actually. There is no equivalent really in the States, for example. Something to be proud of.
And so what are your thoughts in terms of, you've got a bit of a debate in the PR industry of the right to represent. So you've got some agencies who are sort of cab rank principal, any client that comes in, and they, sign a contract, pay their fees, and they actually, and they just start working with them. Others are very particular. They don't want to work for perhaps fossil fuel companies or tobacco or, the traditional sin industries, pornography, gambling. Others are, we don't want to work with countries that have sort of human rights issues. And others are, for instance, I know some who don't want to work with, certain countries that have, a poor record in terms of rights of the LGBTQ community. So do you see that sort of, raging around in the last 10 years? And do you see it settling somewhere? Because it's the people have got such a wide variety of positions.
Yeah, I don't think the issue will ever be settled, to be honest. I think the problem is those more sort of how should we say, kind of like controversial clients will often be the ones that pay the most money. And I think it just seems like the focus changes on what type of clients they are. And you mentioned the kind of traditional sin industries. I think they They may have been the sort of focus a while ago, but now you're right when it's, we talk about sort of representing countries with dubious human rights records, and then obviously fossil fuel companies as well. I think sort of 10 years ago, I don't think there was anywhere near the same focus on fossil fuel companies that there is now, maybe even 5 years ago. Partly due to the amount of campaigning around the climate crisis. So I think that's really significant. But and I wrote a piece on this actually a while ago. It feels like the debates are the same. It's exactly the same. It's kind of can you justify each client? Are you proud to say you work with that client? Sometimes you can justify it on the grounds of somebody else might take it on anyway, so it might as well be you. I'm not sure I go with that. Then you can have, Tim Bell, the late Tim Bell Pottinger's sort of mantra that everyone deserves communications representation in the same way everyone deserves to have a lawyer. I mean, I think that's a discredited idea, but some people might go with that. I mean, I feel that you just got to sort of look at, and then another one actually is the part of the solution debate. We see this all the time when it comes to fossil fuel companies. If you could justify it by saying we're there to help them with their transition to sustainable energy, then that's a good thing. So actually that totally justifies it. So you could take that view. I think with any kind of moral question, you just got to take it on a case-by-case basis and see if you can justify it to yourself. This is why I don't think it'll ever be resolved, because they do, yeah. And then also, we had a podcast on this a while ago, and you could get really deep into this. You could look at things like, okay, let's say if you're not working with a fossil fuel company, what about other polluting companies? What about airlines then? What about fast fashion? What about fast food? What about the big consumer goods manufacturers generally? Or would you work with some brands because they're more environmentally sustainable than other brands in the same group? And what about things they did 10 years ago that they're not doing now? What about if you talk about other countries? What about if that country has relations with the UK? I mean, people talk Saudi Arabia is a big one. People talk about. You could argue Saudi Arabia is an ally of ours that we have a strong diplomatic and sort of military and business relationships with. So if our government works with them, why can't PR agency X work with them as well? So you could take that view. I mean, it's not, that's not like working with Russia, which is our enemy. So,
but 10 years ago it wasn't, and and now this sort of a tense relationship with China. But a few years back, they were we were opening our arms to sort of investment from China. So it's interesting how business development for PR agencies have to be sort of more tuned to geopolitics now. So the PRWeek's Powerbook. Do you get lobbied? Do you get sort of lots of flowers and invites to lunches in the run-up to the Powerbook? Because it really is such an incredible initiative for the PR industry, where people who are in are delighted, people who are out are, can be annoyed, or actually, some feel actually it's not relevant. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, it can be awkward. I mean, each year we get lobbied. We get lobbied far too late. I mean, my view is we don't really accept lobbying, which sounds like an odd thing to say, but our view is people should sort of show their influence throughout the year by, growing their agency or their in-house role or winning awards or, being influential in other ways. What tends to happen is some people find out it's happening, or we publish it, and then people start lobbying us saying, why don't you know how important I am? Or often they get their underlings to do it. It's frustrating, and it's not a scientific process, and there's not actually an application process for it, because it would be completely unmanageable if there was. So it's just an editorial view. And I actually wrote an article last year, it's entitled "So How Do I Get in the Powerbook?", which I sort of tried to answer kind of these sorts of questions and sort of give a vague idea of the kind of things that can sort of encourage people to be in it or lead to people being in it. But as I say, there's not one way of doing it, and it's a huge industry, and some years we're going to miss people out. And it's just sort of the way it is, really. We do our best, and it's a mammoth project, but yeah, definitely no lobbying, I think, is
How many people make it into the Powerbook?
Oh, it's sort of over 400, the most recent one.
And how many professionals are there in the industry, roughly?
It's a good question. I mean, in six figures, isn't it?
Yeah.
Couple of
I guess it also
100,000.
depends on how you define the parameters of PR. And so you mentioned that sort of deciding who gets in and who doesn't is an editorial decision. What sort of things do you look for when you're deciding who goes in and who stays out?
Yeah, I mean, if you go with things like agencies, I mean, there's obviously the size of the agency, and for that we often look at our top 150 project. We can look at agencies that win a lot of awards, that seem to be sort of kind of leading the way with innovation and that sort of thing. People who have kind of senior roles in sort of practice leads or sort of experts in individual parts of the industry is important. So there's that. And in-house, I mean, a lot of it in-house is fairly straightforward, really. If you're a comms director of a big organisation, you've got a reasonable chance. So yeah, a lot of it is stuff like that. But there will always be exceptions. There'll be some people who run sort of agencies that are quite under the radar, and yet their sort of reputation is such that they sort of deserve to be in there. Sometimes people leave if they previously ran an agency and now they started their own, and we don't know how successful that's going to be. It's an untested thing, so we're not going to just sort of put people in necessarily for that reason. So yeah, and I say kind of leading on industry initiatives as well. So we might have people who are known as kind of leading when it comes to things like encouraging environmental and sustainability sort of practices and approaches in the sector, or leading on diversity, or maybe AI and things like that. So there's a number of factors like that, but ultimately we do go by the fact that it's editorial decision rather than a kind of a series of tick boxes.
And you've got some other fantastic initiatives like the Best Places to Work, as well as 30 Under 30. Your Best Places to Work, is it sort of more agency focused or agency and in-house?
Well, it's mostly agency. I mean, we have had in-house categories in the past. To be honest, we get more entries from agencies. I mean, I hope we'll have the in-house category back at some point, and it's good to have it. But there's definitely much more engagement from agencies in that, which is an interesting question as to why that is. But I expect maybe competition for staff in agencies is particularly high these days.
That's true. And what sort of factors do you look for? What makes an agency a good place to work?
Yeah, well, I mean, for that, it kind of works slightly differently because there is a judging panel for that. So it works a bit like a kind of more sort of traditional award scheme. But they'll look at things like sort of leading on initiatives around sort of generous sort of pay and career development. A kind of progressive approach to diversity and inclusion is really important. Just kind of, maybe things like perhaps equity options and the sort of the kind of growth of like the employee ownership trusts are interesting in that sense. We'll look at things like sort of react to the kind of, I mean, there's a sort of the kind of perks elements, and obviously there are sort of soft perks that are interesting but not necessarily kind of that important when it comes to actually winning. But things like, you get some agencies that might pay for sort of transport sometimes, or they might even give loans and things like that. And then initiatives to sort of include people. And I know some of this stuff it can be a bit less tangible than sort of concrete policies, but sometimes it's sort of, if you see that there are some people who don't feel that included and you want to sort of find ways to do that, it might be sort of certain events or initiatives that you have to encourage that to happen. So there are a number of different ways. And I think it's one of the hardest things to win, actually, because I think, we have a lot of awards. We have 7 award schemes a year at the moment. And this is one where you definitely can't fluke it by having a good campaign. Sometimes it might be that the stars might align for like a really good creative campaign, but for this, it's really about the sort of fundamentals of how the business works and the culture. So it's a difficult thing to win, but
it is. You also have 30 under 30, and you talked earlier about diversity, and of course diversity is across multiple different areas, be it ethnic, gender, neurodiversity, socioeconomic, but also age. So if you're 30 under 30, do you also have a 50 over 50?
No, people say this quite a lot. I mean, in a way we do, and it's called the Powerbook. I mean, this is usually my response. I mean, the reason we have 30 under 30 is partly because we don't generally sort of regularly kind of hear from as many people under 30, because, you think about it, in something like PRWeek, most of the people who are quoted will be the bosses of agencies, or they'll be senior people at agencies, or they'll be comms directors, or they'll be, sort of seasoned consultants, or maybe the bosses of trade bodies and so on. Not many people in those categories are under 30. So although we do, include people under 30, from time to time, and we're certainly not against it, inevitably our stories are going to quote people most of the time who are over 30. So in a way, it's an opportunity to sort of focus on a group that isn't in the title as much as maybe, your average agency boss or comms director. So
I think everyone listening is very aware of PRWeek. It's, it's a very sort of well-known and well-respected title, but I think some people aren't aware of the breadth of everything that you do. So just to remind everybody that there are sister titles like Campaign, Management Today, Third Sector, and they have two-tier subscriptions: the Information, which is sort of the basic subscription, and Knowledge, which is premium. And they have, I subscribe to the sort of the UK, the US, and the Middle Eastern bulletins, which really give you a good global sort of idea of what's happening in the industry. Also, podcast, multiple conferences, and awards. Now, I'm going to move to the next section, the last section, where I wanted to ask you, who is the communicator that you admire the most, be it past or present?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I feel that I'm sort of struggling a bit, because I think the essence of being a good communicator is using as few words as possible to say the most and to have the most impact. And I think if you think in those terms, someone like Churchill was an absolute genius at it. I mean, I don't think there are many people who can sort of rival that sort of rhetorical kind of talent. It feels like an incredibly obvious person to pick. And obviously someone who's from a completely different time. But I think the fact that it's so memorable, what he said and the way he said things was really notable. Just thinking in terms of more contemporary examples. I think
Churchill's a good one, actually, because I think he stands at the test of time. Now, I know that we're running out of time, so I wanted to just say a huge thank you, John. It's been such a fascinating conversation, sharing your journey with our community, because in a way we're sort of, you're always sharing about the industry, and it's so lovely to actually know who's on the other side. And so I wanted to also thank our audience for listening. You'll be able to find this episode on the PRCA's YouTube channel, on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, alongside other episodes interviewed by my co-host Dan Gold and myself. If you like what you hear, then please do share so we can grow our community. If you have any feedback or any topics you'd like us to cover, please get in contact. We publish interviews every 2 weeks, so stay tuned as we have some inspiring stories in the pipeline. Thank you again, John.
Thank you.